With Arthur Thompson at the New York State Military Museum and Veterans Research Center in Saratoga Springs, New York. It is November 20th, 2002, approximately 11:15 a.m. The interviewer is Michael Russert. Could you give me your full name, your date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Yes, my full name is Arthur Frederick Thompson. I was born on April 5th, 1925, and I was born in Port Henry, New York, which is on the banks of Lake Champlain.
What was your pre-war education?
When I went into service, I was a fresh 18-year-old boy who had graduated from high school the previous June, and I went back to school and post-graduated because I was anxious to go in service but couldn't, because the Army was only taking 18-year-olds at that point. I could have gone in the Navy, but I wasn't interested in the Navy. Okay.
Why did you select the Army?
Well, during the late 30s, I was very intrigued with the Russian-Finnish War, when the ski troopers in the Finnish Army were very active, and in Port Henry, I was probably one of the only 2 or 3 that skied. And so I used to enjoy, as a 15, 16-year-old kid, skiing through the woods above our house and kind of make-believing I was a ski trooper, and my ambition was to be a ski trooper. And later on, of course, when I decided to join, the National Ski Patrol was doing the recruiting for the ski troops of the United States Army. It's the only civilian organization that ever did any recruiting for the military, and what they were looking for were skiers to develop a ski division out in Colorado at Camp Hale, is where the training center was. So in order to qualify, you had to have 3 letters of recommendation and send them to the National Ski Patrol, and they in turn contacted the Army and either agreed that you were a candidate or not. And I received a letter back from the National Ski Patrol saying that when I finished basic training, I would be assigned to Camp Hale, Colorado, which was where the ski troop training center was at that time. I enlisted in the Army Reserve, which you could do at age 17, and then 1 month after my birthday, in April of 1943, I was called to active duty and went to reported at Camp Upton, New York, which was the processing center. And after several days of processing, I was put on the troop train with a lot of other people and went to Fort McClellan, Alabama, where I did my basic training. Basic training lasted for 16 weeks. At the end of the 16 weeks, we were called out on the company street, and the first sergeant read off the list of the soldiers from our unit who would be on the troop train the next morning to go to Fort Ord, California, and deployment to the Pacific as replacements. And lo and behold, my name was on that list. And I have to tell you, I was a little bit excited about it. And when the formation was dismissed, I walked into the orderly room and said to the first sergeant, I can't be on that list. I have a letter here that says I'm going to Camp Hale, Colorado, where the ski troops are training, and this letter says that that's where I'm supposed to go. And the first sergeant's reply was, soldier, you'll go where you're told you're going to go. And with that, the company commander was in his office, and he said, First Sergeant, what's going on? And the first sergeant said, well, Private Thompson thinks he's going to the ski troops, and we've got him on the list to go to Fort Ord, California. Well, the next morning, they dismissed me, and the next morning, when the group fell out to go to Fort Ord, California, the first sergeant said, Private Thompson, go back to the barracks. And I sat in the barracks for 5 days. At the end of 5 days, lo and behold, the first sergeant came down and he said, here are your orders, you're going to Camp Hale, Colorado. And so I was put on a train all by myself and went from Fort McClellan, Alabama to Camp Hale, Colorado, where we trained for the next year and a few months in mountain warfare and ski patrol. And it was the beginning of the activation of the 10th Mountain Division, which was the only ski mountain division in the United States Army in World War II.
Could you explain some of the specialized training that you received?
Yes, because I was a skier and had skied, you had to pass a special test to determine that you were qualified to be a ski trooper. And we were issued, of course, skis and parkas and ski boots and poles. And after you passed that test, then you were taken on marches, ski marches, where you had rucksacks, which were special to our division. We didn't have a pack like the regular infantry people had. We had a rucksack, which carried 90 pounds of equipment. And if you couldn't ski with 90 pounds of equipment on your back, they soon found another job for you. I qualified as a machine gunner, and at the point where our company, F Company of the 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment, where it was formed, I was the youngest in our machine gun squad, and they asked me if I would like to be the sergeant of the squad. And as an 18-year-old kid just turning 19, I became a sergeant. And I was a machine gun squad leader for the entire time from that point on. At the end of our training in Camp Hale, we went down to Camp Swift, Texas, where all kinds of rumors, as the Army always has, came across about the fact that we weren't going to be trained, or we weren't going to fight as a mountain division, but we were going to be retrained as a flatland division, and we were going to just be put wherever they needed such a division. Well, in the meantime, what was happening was the war in Italy had gotten to the North Apennines, and they reached a stalemate, and they were in the Apennine Mountains, and General Clark, who was the commander of the Fifth Army in Italy, told General Marshall, or told someone in the War Department, that they needed some special troops. And so lo and behold, the 10th Mountain Division was put on troop trains, sent to Fort Patrick Henry, Virginia at Norfolk, put on well, we were put on several ships. We were on the SS Argentina, the 86th Mountain Infantry, and we spent 11 days going from Norfolk, Virginia to Naples, Italy. And the trip was very exciting because we had no escorts, and of course those of us that didn't like the water anyway were concerned about where the submarines were and when they were going to come and get us. But
were you
nothing happened.
Single ship, or were you in a convoy?
Single ship, one ship. The USS Argentina was now a troop ship, and it went straight through Gibraltar and straight to Naples, one ship, and no escorts at all. The rest of the division were we were the first regiment out, and we were the first regiment to reach Naples, and the rest of the division followed in a convoy. And why we were shipped off, I guess it was because the Argentina was a faster ship, and they figured didn't need to have an escort. But anyway, we arrived in Naples, Italy on Christmas Eve in 1944. And being 19, we just turned 19, my best friend and I and a couple of other fellows, we decided that Christmas Eve in Naples, Italy just wasn't very nice, and so we found a wine cellar, and we all proceeded to get very sick. I had never had anything alcoholic to drink before that, and for the next, well, until my youngest son graduated from college, I didn't have any anymore. It was a very difficult situation because the next day they put us on a cattle boat and shipped us from Naples up to Leghorn. And Leghorn was the port just below the Apennines in that area, and they took us off the boat. And needless to say, that was a rough ride for us because we weren't feeling too good. But anyway, they took us off the boat and trucked us up to an encampment area near the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And that's where we had our first casualties. One of the fellows was walking guard duty along the railroad tracks, and he stepped on a mine, and 2 or 3 fellows ran to help him or to get down there with him, and they stepped on a couple of other mines, and we had 2 or 3 fellows killed at that point. Soon after that, a few days later, we went on the front lines. We were the 1st regiment of the division on front line, and we were in a stalemate position where they were just breaking us in. I was able to go on one patrol, and we ran into a German bunker and had a firefight, and that was our baptism from the standpoint of what combat was all about. We were there for 8 or 10 days. The rest of the division caught up with us, and they put us on the front at that location, which was toward the western end of the Apennine Mountains, North Apennine Mountains. And the stalemate was caused by the Germans having control of Mount Belvedere, which was the prominent point on the in the Apennine line, and they were able to control the roads going into Bologna from the Mount Belvedere area, and they had observation posts on Riva Ridge, which was to the west of Mount Belvedere. So anybody that tried to take Mount Belvedere ran into a difficult situation because the observers were able to pour the artillery down on them. Well, our general said to the division, "You guys were trained to be mountain soldiers, now you're going to be mountain soldiers." And so in order to take Mount Belvedere had been taken 3 times before that, and the Germans repulsed it in counterattacks, and they lost it. So that was where the stalemate was caused. And so in order to take it, we had to take Riva Ridge, which was the ridge where the observation was. And the 1st Battalion of our 86th Regiment and F Company, which was the company I was in, were assigned to take the ridge. And F Company was to protect the left flank of the 1st Battalion, and we started up that ridge. It was about a 1,500-foot ridge, and we started up at 9 o'clock at night and reached the top of the ridge just as daylight in the morning, and attacked and drove the Germans off that ridge. And they had 2 or 3 counterattacks, which we repulsed. And we secured the ridge, and once we secured the ridge, the main force then started the battle up Mount Belvedere, and 2 days later we took Mount Belvedere. When Belvedere was secured, our F Company came down off the ridge and joined the rest of our 2nd Battalion, and we went around on the east side of Mount Belvedere and were attacking there until the next stop, and we were stopped for a few weeks and regrouped, and then we started the final push out into the Po Valley. At that point, just before we reached the Po Valley, several weeks before we reached the Po Valley, my best friend was killed when a mortar shell landed a direct hit on his foxhole. He and the platoon sergeant, he was the platoon messenger, and a mortar shell landed a direct hit on their foxhole. And at that time I had some pieces of shrapnel from another situation and was awarded the Purple Heart at that point. Was back in the hospital in Florence for a while and in the rest area at Montecatini, and then came back up and joined the division and joined the regiment, our company, just as we broke out of the Apennines into the Po Valley. And then they put a task force together, which was led by the 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment, and we sped across the Po Valley, hoping to cut the Germans off before they got to the highways that went up into the Brenner Pass and back into Germany. we got to the Po Valley way ahead of any of our amphibious vehicles or any boats that we had. So we went across the Po River in little rubber boats with 5 or 6 fellows to a boat, paddling like hell, and the current was stiff, so that we ended up half a mile down from where we went into the river, and were able to get across the river and establish a foothold. And then the pontoon people came up and eventually got the bridges across, and the whole rest of the division came. At one point, the 10th Mountain Division, this task force, was 65 miles ahead of the rest of the front in Italy. And we were exposed on both flanks. We were exposed behind us, really, except for the supply line that was coming up with us. And we got into Verona 2 days before the rest of the division caught up online. And from Verona, General Hayes, who was a tremendous tactician, he was a Medal of Honor winner in World War I, and he was our commanding general all the way through. And he said to General Clark and the boys back in the headquarters, we can get to the Brenner Pass, and if we can get to the Brenner Pass, we can cut off everything that comes out of Italy going back to Germany, except those that go the other routes. So we took off again and went up along Lake Garda. There was a highway on both sides. On the west side of Lake Garda was where Mussolini had his big palace, summer estate. And we were on the right-hand road, highway going along Lake Garda. And Lake Garda on the eastern side had 7 tunnels along the lake. And when we got to the first tunnel, the Germans had an 88 in the tunnel, and as we came up over the hill, the first shots were fired from the tunnel, and we realized that we were in trouble. And at that point, F Company was in the lead, and I was awarded a Bronze Star there because I directed artillery fire into the tunnel, and finally the Germans pulled the 88 back and went back on toward Torbole up at the other end of the tunnel. They then put some of the 87th Regiment in ducks, and they went across the lake and captured Mussolini's summer place, and were trying to cut off the Germans coming up the road on that side.
Okay, and excuse me for a minute, what is a duck?
A duck is an amphibious vehicle that carries troops. They used a lot of them in the South Pacific. It was a transportation group that was attached to us at the time that we were going across the Po Valley. They were used later on going across the river before they got the bridge up. But they weren't like landing craft. They didn't have a front that went down. You climbed over the side. But as we were going...
Did they go on land?
Yes, they were wheeled. They were wheeled vehicles. They were big, probably about a platoon, 40 men or so. And as we were going up the lake, what we did was got in the boat, in the duck, just ahead of the first tunnel, and we landed about the 5th tunnel up. So we had to go back through, had to go through the last couple of tunnels. And as you're going up the lake, you can see the 88 shells landing in the water. And it was, needless to say, for a guy that doesn't like water, it was a harrowing kind of experience. But anyway, we landed, and as we went through the 6th tunnel, we discovered that one of our shells had hit that tunnel, and the Germans that were in there were really annihilated, and we found that we were walking over bodies through that 6th tunnel until we got to the 7th. We got to the town of Torbole, and that's where we had our assistant division commander was Colonel Bill Darby, who was the head of the Darby's Rangers in World War II, and the Rangers were no longer being utilized as such, and so they gave General Darby a command as assistant division commander of our division, with the idea that he would become a general and then eventually become commanding of his own division. And at Torbole, General Tarpe was killed shortly before the war was over. We went from Torbole up to Garda, which was at the end of the lake, and we were 4 miles above Garda on the road going into the Brenner Pass when the war was over. And we had thought we were going to get all the way to the Brenner Pass. When the Germans in Italy surrendered, they wanted General Hayes to be the general who accepted the surrender, because he was the general that ran that mountain division, which caused them all their problems. So we all felt honored that he was asked to do that. So the war was over, and so then they were having problems over in Yugoslavia, and Mr. The man who was the dictator in Yugoslavia, Tito, was anxious to take over the free city of Trieste, and so the Allies sent the 10th Mountain Division up there to make sure that he didn't get the free city of Trieste. So we were there for probably 3 or 4 weeks, and then we were replaced by soldiers of the 32nd Division, and we were embarked or trucked back to Leghorn, where we got on ships and came back to the United States with the idea that the 10th Mountain Division was going to be going to the Pacific and was going to be involved in the invasion of Japan. Well, while we were on the ocean coming back, the first atomic bomb was dropped, and when I got home, we went into Norfolk, Virginia again, and they sent us up to Fort Dix, and from there we went home on a 30-day furlough with the idea that we'd then report back to Camp Carson, Colorado, and be retrained and then go to the Pacific. Well, I got home, and I was in the drugstore sitting on a stool when they dropped the second bomb. And I was sitting on that same stool at that same drugstore on December 7th, 1941, when the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor and started the war. So I had gone full circle. Went back to Camp Carson, went to Camp Carson, and immediately they sent us back home for another 30 days because the war was over. And they didn't know what to do with us, so they shipped us all back home. And so I went back home for a second 30-day leave, went back to Camp Carson and got discharged, and then came back to Port Henry from discharge. And at that point I was determined that I was going to go on to college and get an education as a public school teacher, and that's what I did. I think the 10th Mountain Division influenced that because our company commander was later the governor of the state of Massachusetts, Francis Sargent. And we had, the 10th Mountain Division was an all-volunteer outfit. And as such, we had college kids all over the place who were skiers, who were people that rock climbed and mountain climbed, and we had a lot of forest rangers. We had a lot of real classy people. At one time, the 10th Mountain Division was reported to have had the highest IQ in the United States Army, and I believe they did have, because all of the platoon sergeants were all 2 or 3 years of college. All the officers were college graduates. They were all quality people. From Eisenhower at one point was reported to have said, "I can't use that Ivy League crowd in Europe." But I don't know was he said that, but that was one of the comments that's made. So that's about the experience I had. And I became a school teacher and have been very active since the war in the 10th Mountain Division Association. In fact, was the president of the New York State chapter and national vice president at one point.
You answered a couple of my questions. Could you tell me, compare your feelings? You sat on the same stool when you heard about Pearl Harbor. What was your reaction when you did hear about Pearl Harbor?
very, excited about the fact that we were now in this thing, and that everybody had to go and serve. And I had two older brothers, and immediately the oldest one went in the Navy, and soon after that the second oldest one went in the Navy, and I was determined there was no way I was going to go in the Navy because I didn't enjoy the water that much. One of them ended up on a floating dry dock in the South Pacific, and the other one and was bombed a few times, and the other one ended up in Trinidad on Navy patrol bombers patrolling for submarines. Out of the submarines had ringed the entrance to the Panama Canal, and their job, one of his jobs, his group was to make sure that those submarines didn't get the shipping that was going through the canal to the Pacific, because these ships were coming out of Boston and New York and New Orleans and all the big ports and heading for the canal.
How about your feelings the second time when you heard about the second nuclear?
Elation, pure elation, because we knew that if we were going to be in on the invasion of Japan, the expectation was for something like 70% casualties, 70 to 80% casualties. And that would probably mean that our division was going to be used somewhere where the cliffs were, the mountains were, in the entrance to Tokyo. We later found out that we were in reserve. We were scheduled to be in reserve and would be landed after the initial landing when the war was over. And when they deactivated our division at Camp Carson, General Hayes had a division review, and he called the entire division. At that point, we weren't very many more than 8,000 or 9,000, because a lot of them had already been discharged. They had high points. And he called us in and showed us the map of the invasion and showed us what was going to happen and so forth. And I was most relieved at that point. I'd done what I wanted to do, or I had to do, and it was time for me to go on to college.
Did you use the GI Bill?
Yes, I did. The GI Bill was probably the greatest law that the United States Congress ever passed. I think the GI Bill should be available for everybody who ever served in service.
You said you were active in the 10th Mountain organization. Have you been active in any other veterans organizations?
Well, I belong to the American Legion, but the American Legion isn't, yes, I go to the Legion Post and so forth and so on, but my allegiance has been with the 10th Mountain. When they activated the 10th Mountain Division in 1985 up at Fort Drum, one of the things that was said was that they made provisions for this brand new modern fort up there, and it is the most modern military installation in the world. That nobody had ever made any provisions for anything at the main gate, and most posts across the country had a monument of some kind at the main gate. And so I was asked to serve as chairman of a committee that raised $115,000, and we put a monument at the main gate at Fort Drum. And that was, I consider that was my contribution to today's 10th Mountain Division, which is the division that just came home from Afghanistan, and they've been the most deployed division in the United States Army in this last 15 years.
Obviously, then you've attended reunions.
Yes, we have a reunion every 3 years, and I've been back to Italy twice. The second time I went back to Italy, my son went with me. The first time my wife went with me, and the second time my son went with me, so I was able to show both of them what we had done while we were over there.
How did the war then, do you think, it affected your life?
Well, there's no question about it. My family were all railroaders, and I probably never would have gone to college if it hadn't been for the GI Bill and the World War II. And I became a school teacher and eventually became a superintendent of schools, and was able to be the superintendent of schools in Lake Placid for 18 years. And one of my dreams as a young kid was to someday live in Lake Placid. And so we spent 40 years of our life there, with all of our kids graduating from the school there. And so life has been good. My best buddy was left in Italy, and I often wonder what would have happened if he had lived as I had been able to.
Could you tell us about this? When was that taken, the photograph? Could you hold it up a little bit, please, to the camera, and tell us when that was taken?
That picture was taken the week before we left Patrick Henry, Virginia. I had not had a picture taken since I'd had my sergeant stripes sewn on, and my mother, in one of her letters, said, "When are you going to send us a picture?" So I had this taken the week before we left Patrick Henry in Norfolk, Virginia, and so that it looks different than it does than I do today. But my best friend, who as I said, we left in Italy, he and I both went down and had our pictures taken. In fact, I have a copy of his hanging in my wall at home.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you very much for asking me.